The old van shuddered to a stop outside the gates, the engine giving a final, protesting cough. For a moment, I just sat there, hands gripping the worn vinyl of the steering wheel, my breath fogging the cool morning air inside the cab. The gates weren't just gates, they were a statement. Black iron, tall and ornate, with a stone wall snaking away into the dense woods on either side. Beyond them, a long, winding gravel drive disappeared under a canopy of ancient oaks. This wasn't a house, it was an estate. My stomach did a slow, nervous flip. My business, keynote tuning, was mostly me, this van, and a set of tools that had seen better decades. I specialized in older pianos, the ones the big companies didn't want to touch. It was quiet work, methodical work, and it kept my head down and the rent paid. Barely. The call for this job had been different. A clipped, polite voice on the phone, a Mr. Croft, inquiring about a full regulation and tuning for a Steinway Grand. He didn't ask about the price. That was the first clue. The second was the address he gave me, a place I'd only ever heard locals whisper about. I pressed the call button on the intercom, my thumb feeling clumsy and thick. A moment of static, and then the same voice, impossibly clear. Yes, Leo Vance, I said, my own voice sounding thin. For the piano. There was a pause, just long enough for me to imagine him checking a leather-bound appointment book. Then a low buzz sounded, and the heavy gates began to swing inward with a silent, hydraulic grace. I put the van in gear, the engine groaning back to life, and rolled slowly onto the gravel. The sound of my tires crunching was the only noise in the world. It felt like an intrusion. The house came into view as I rounded the final bend, and I had to physically stop myself from gaping. It was old stone, covered in ivy, with dark windows that seemed to watch my approach. It wasn't ostentatious, not a modern glass palace, but it had a weight to it, a sense of permanence that made my transient life feel flimsy as a moth's wing. I parked where the drive widened into a courtyard, near a detached garage that was probably bigger than my entire apartment building. I was halfway through pulling my tool case from the back when the front door opened. He stood there, framed in the dark wood of the doorway. Julian Croft. He was older than I'd expected, maybe early 60s, with silver hair cut short and a face that looked like it had been carved from something enduring. He wore simple gray trousers and a dark blue cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my van. But it was his stillness that struck me. He wasn't moving, just watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't unfriendly, but it was assessing. The weight of his gaze was a physical thing. "Mr. Vance," he said. His voice was a low baritone, calm and measured. It suited the house. "Mr. Croft," I answered, giving a small nod as I approached, my heavy case in hand. "Thank you for the work." He inclined his head, a gesture that was both a greeting and a dismissal of my thanks. "The piano is this way." He led me through a cavernous entryway with a slate floor and into a room that took my breath away. It was a library, or maybe a music room, or both. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with old, leather-bound volumes. The fourth wall was almost entirely glass, looking out onto a manicured garden where a fine mist was still clinging to the rose bushes. And in the center of the room, on a dark, polished wood floor, sat the piano. It was a Steinway Model D, a concert grand, its ebony finish gleaming even in the soft morning light. It was magnificent. I felt a familiar reverence settle over me, the same feeling I got every time I stood before an instrument with history. It pushed the nervousness away, replacing it with a quiet focus. This was my world. This I understood. "It hasn't been played in some time," Julian Croft said, his voice softer now. He stood near the windows, his hands clasped behind his back, giving me space. "It may need more than a simple tuning. That's what I'm here for," I said, setting my case down gently on the rug beside the piano bench. I ran a hand over the closed lid, feeling the smooth, cool lacquer. It was like touching something sacred. I could already feel the potential humming beneath my fingertips, a sleeping giant waiting to be woken. I spent the first hour just getting to know the instrument. I opened it up, my movements slow and deliberate. The inside was clean, thankfully. No signs of mice or damp. But the felt on the hammers was compacted, the action was sluggish, and when I played a simple C major scale, the sound was dull and uneven. It was a thoroughbred gone to seed, a voice that had forgotten how to sing. Julian didn't leave. He settled into a leather armchair in the corner with a book, but I knew he wasn't really reading. I could feel his eyes on me from time to time, a quiet, unobtrusive presence. It should have made me anxious, working under the owner's watch, but somehow it didn't. His stillness was calming, as if his quiet confidence in hiring me was enough for both of us. The work was painstaking. I started with the action, removing it from the key bed and placing it on my portable cradle. I began the long, meditative process of regulating the keys, adjusting the delicate dance of levers and pins that translated a player's touch into sound. Each key had dozens of adjustment points, and my focus narrowed until the vast room, the wealthy man in the corner, and my own rumbling stomach faded away. There was only the mechanism, the tools in my hands, and the pursuit of a perfect, frictionless response. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, casting long shadows through the great windows. At some point, I became aware of a gentle clink of china. Julian had risen and was placing a tray on a small table near me. On it was a steaming mug, a small pitcher of cream, and a plate of shortbread cookies. "You should take a break," he said, his voice pulling me out of my trance. I blinked, my eyes struggling to refocus on the room around me. My back ached, and my fingers were stiff. "Oh, thank you. I didn't realize the time. Good work requires concentration," he said simply. He gestured to the chair opposite his. "Please." It felt strange to sit in a plush leather chair in my dusty work clothes, but I was too grateful for the coffee to refuse. It was dark and strong and wonderful. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was a comfortable one, like two people sharing a space without the need to fill it with noise. "You're very methodical," he finally said, looking at the disassembled action on my workbench. "It's the only way," I replied, taking a bite of a cookie. It melted in my mouth. "Rush a job like this, you do more harm than good. These instruments, they have memories. You have to respect that." He looked from the piano to me, and for the first time, his gaze felt less assessing and more interested. "Memories," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "An interesting way to put it. They remember the hands that played them," I explained, warming to my subject. "The temperature of the rooms they lived in, the humidity. A piano that's been played with a heavy hand will have a different feel than one played delicately. You have to listen to what it's telling you before you can fix it," he nodded slowly, his eyes holding mine. "And what is this one telling you?" I thought for a moment, looking at the magnificent, silent instrument. "That it's been lonely," I said, and then immediately felt a flush of heat creep up my neck. It was too personal, too fanciful. "I mean, it's just been sitting unplayed for a long time." He didn't laugh or dismiss it. He just gave another small, slow nod. "Yes," he said, his voice very quiet. "It has." The rest of the day passed in a similar rhythm. I worked, he sat. He didn't speak again, but his presence was a constant, a quiet anchor in the corner of the room. When dusk began to purple the sky, I knew I was done for the day. The action was regulated, but the tuning would have to wait for tomorrow. A job this extensive couldn't be done in one go. I started packing my tools, my movements neat and practiced. "I've done as much as I can for today," I announced to the quiet room. "The regulation is complete. I'll need to come back tomorrow to start on the pitch raise and the fine-tuning. It'll take a few visits for it to settle properly." He closed his book, marking his page with a thin leather bookmark. "Of course," he said, rising from his chair. "That's perfectly acceptable. Take as long as you need." He walked me to the door, the slate floor echoing our footsteps. At the threshold, I turned to him. "Thank you again for the coffee." And the cookies. A faint smile touched the corners of his mouth. It changed his entire face, softening the stern lines around his eyes. "It's the least I can do. I'll see you in the morning, Leo." He used my first name. It was such a small thing, but it sent a strange warmth through my chest. He hadn't called me Mr. Vance. He had called me Leo. Driving back down the long gravel drive, the van felt smaller, shabbier. My world felt smaller. I had spent the day in a place of quiet beauty and substance, a place where time seemed to move differently. And I had been watched over by a man who moved with a quiet grace I found myself envying, and, if I was being honest, admiring. I pushed the thought away. He was a client. A wealthy, older client. That was all. But as I drove home to my cramped apartment, the memory of his quiet presence and the unexpected kindness of a cup of coffee stayed with me. It was a note of warmth in the otherwise solitary composition of my life. The second day was much like the first. I arrived. The gates swung open without me needing to call, and Julian was waiting at the door. He was dressed in a similar fashion, simple, expensive clothes that hung on his frame with an easy elegance. He greeted me with a nod and that same quiet, assessing gaze. "Good morning, Leo, Mr. Croft, Julian," he corrected me gently. Please, my throat felt a little tight. "Julian," I repeated. It felt strange on my tongue, too familiar. But I nodded and followed him back to the music room. Today was about the tuning. I started with the pitch raise, a rough, brute force process of bringing all 230-some strings up to tension. The piano groaned and pinged under the strain, its voice raw and discordant. It was a necessary violence before the artistry could begin. Throughout the process, Julian sat in his chair, reading, or pretending to. I was becoming more and more certain that the book was just a prop. He seemed to be studying me as much as I was studying the piano. I could feel the weight of his attention, but it still didn't feel like pressure. It felt like curiosity. I wondered what he saw. A young man with calloused fingers and worn-out jeans, coaxing a soul back into a machine of wood and wire? A simple tradesman in a world of unimaginable wealth? I didn't know. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. It was easier to focus on the task at hand. After the pitch raise, I let the instrument rest, allowing the frame and strings to acclimate to the new tension. Julian must have sensed the shift in my work because he looked up from his book. "Is something wrong?" "No, not at all," I assured him. "It just needs to sit for a bit. Settle, like letting dough rise. I'll start the fine-tuning in an hour or so," he nodded. "Lunch will be ready in 30 minutes, he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I opened my mouth to protest, to say I had a sandwich in the van, but the look on his face stopped me. It wasn't a request. It was a simple statement of fact, and I found I didn't have the will to argue. We ate in a sun-drenched breakfast nook that overlooked the gardens. A quiet woman I hadn't seen before served us a simple lunch of soup and fresh bread, then disappeared as silently as she'd arrived. Eating with him was like sitting with him in the music room. The silence was comfortable, punctuated only by the clink of our spoons against the bowls. I found myself watching his hands. They were large and well-kept, but they weren't soft. There were lines etched into his palms and a strength in his fingers that suggested they were no stranger to work, even if that work was now just signing papers or tending his garden. They were capable hands. The thought came unbidden, and I quickly looked down at my soup. "Is the work always this solitary?" he asked, his voice pulling me from my thoughts. I swallowed a mouthful of bread. "Most of the time. I prefer it. It's hard to concentrate with someone hovering, asking questions, and I'm not hovering." The question was direct, but there was a hint of something else in his tone, a genuine concern. I met his gaze. His eyes were a deep, clear gray, like a winter sky. "No," I said, and the honesty of it surprised even me. "You're present. It's different." He seemed to consider this for a moment. "Good," he said finally, and that was the end of the conversation. The afternoon was spent in the delicate, intricate dance of fine-tuning. I worked from the center of the keyboard outwards, setting the temperament, creating the harmonic foundation upon which the entire piano would rest. It was a process of intense listening, of hearing the subtle beats between intervals, of adjusting the tension of a string by a fraction of a turn. My world shrank to the space of a single octave, then a single note. I was so lost in the work that I didn't notice him move until he was standing beside the piano, just a few feet away. I finished tuning the note I was on, letting the sound decay into silence before I looked up at him. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "I didn't mean to disturb you. It's all right," I said, my heart beating a little faster at his proximity. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, something woody and subtle. I was just finishing this section. He looked down at the strings, at the forest of tuning pins. "It's a fascinating process," he said. "So much precision required for something that ultimately produces emotion. That's the whole point, I guess," I murmured, my eyes tracing the graceful curve of the piano's iron frame. "All this math and physics, it's all in service of the music." He reached out, his fingers hovering just above the brass-wound bass strings, not quite touching them. "My wife used to play," he said, his voice dropping even lower, so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "Every evening. This room was never silent. It was the first time he'd mentioned anyone else. The quiet admission hung in the air between us, a fragile, unexpected thing. I didn't know what to say. I'm sorry, felt inadequate. So I said nothing. I just sat there on the bench, my tuning lever in my hand, and let him have his moment of memory. He drew his hand back, his expression unreadable again. It has been silent for a very long time, he said, more to himself than to me. Then he seemed to shake himself, just slightly, and his focus returned to me. It will need another tuning after it settles, you said? Yes, I confirmed, my voice a little rough. In a week or two, and maybe one more after that. A piano that's been neglected this long has a tendency to drift. Good, he said, with a finality that felt like a closed door. Let me know when you'd like to schedule it. He then turned and walked back to his chair, picking up his book as if the brief, personal confession had never happened. But it had. The room felt different now. It was no longer just his house. It was a place that held his history, his loss. And the piano wasn't just an instrument. It was a vessel of memory, a silent monument to a life that had been lived within these walls. My work suddenly felt heavier, more important. I wasn't just tuning strings. I was waking a voice that had been sleeping for a long, long time. When I left that evening, he walked me to the door again. As I stepped out into the cool evening air, he spoke. Thank you, Leo. It's my job, I said. No, he said, and his gray eyes were serious. Thank you for being careful with it. I understood he wasn't just talking about the piano. Over the next 2 weeks, I returned to Julian's house twice more. The routine became familiar, comfortable. The silent opening of the gates, the quiet greeting at the door, the long hours in the music room with his steady presence in the corner. We didn't talk much, but the silence felt increasingly full of unspoken things. I learned the rhythms of his house. The way the light fell across the floor in the late afternoon. The distant chime of the grandfather clock marking the hours. The smell of old paper and lemon oil. It was a world away from my own life, which was filled with the noise of traffic, the smell of exhaust fumes, and the constant, low-grade hum of financial anxiety. During my third visit, I was packing up my tools, the final tuning complete. The piano was transformed. I played a few chords, and the sound filled the room, rich and resonant and perfectly balanced. The voice was back. It was clear and strong. It sounds beautiful, Julian said from his chair. It's holding the tuning well, I said, a swell of professional pride rising in me. It's a remarkable instrument. I stood up from the bench, running a hand over the polished fallboard one last time. Well, that should do it. It might need a seasonal touch-up in 6 months or so, but it's stable now. My job was finished. The thought landed with a hollow thud in my chest. There was no reason for me to come back. I started to write up my invoice, my movements feeling slow, reluctant. Julian rose and came to stand by the piano. He didn't say anything, just looked at it, his expression thoughtful. The silence stretched. I finished the invoice and held it out to him. He took it without looking at it, placing it on the piano's music desk. His eyes were on me. There is another matter I'd like to discuss with you, if you have a moment, of course, I said, my heart giving a nervous little kick. I have a collection of old sheet music, he began, his gaze drifting towards the overflowing shelves. It belonged to my wife. It's disorganized, and some of it is quite fragile. I was wondering if you might be interested in a small project, helping me catalog it. Your knowledge of music would be invaluable, and you have a careful touch. I was stunned. It was a lifeline, an excuse to keep coming back, and he was offering it so calmly, so matter-of-factly. But a warning bell went off in my head. I was a piano tuner, not an archivist, and this felt different. It felt like he was creating a job for me. My pride, stubborn and foolish as it often was, bristled. Mr. Croft, Julian, I appreciate the offer, but that's not really what I do. I know, he said, his gaze unwavering. But I would pay you your usual hourly rate. It would be a great help to me. I've been meaning to do it for years, but I can't seem to face it alone. The last part was said so quietly, with such a profound and simple honesty, that it disarmed me completely. I can't seem to face it alone. He was admitting a vulnerability, a crack in his stoic facade. He wasn't just creating a job. He was asking for help, for company. And I, who knew loneliness like the back of my own hand, couldn't say no to that. Okay, I heard myself say. Yes, I can do that. The faint smile returned to his lips. Excellent, he said. We can start next week, if that suits you. so a new routine began. I would arrive 2 mornings a week. We would work in the music room, but at a large oak table he'd cleared near the windows. He'd bring down boxes of sheet music from the attic, and we would sit side by side, sorting through the fragile, yellowed pages. The work was slow and quiet. We'd sort by composer, by period, by instrument. I created a simple cataloging system on my laptop, entering each piece with notes on its condition. It was peaceful, and the proximity to him was both a comfort and a quiet torture. Sometimes our hands would brush as we reached for the same stack of paper. A simple, accidental contact that would send a jolt through my entire body. He never acknowledged it, never pulled away. He would just continue with his work as if nothing had happened, leaving me to deal with the frantic thumping of my own heart. I learned more about him through the music than I ever could through conversation. He had loved a woman who loved Chopin and Debussy, a woman who had tried her hand at composing her own simple melodies, which we found scribbled on the back of napkins and tucked inside books. One afternoon, I found a photograph pressed between the pages of a book of sonatas. It was a picture of a younger Julian, his hair still dark, standing with his arm around a smiling woman. They were on a boat, the wind in their hair, and they looked incandescently happy. I felt a sharp, unexpected pang of something. Jealousy? No, that wasn't it. It was a deep, aching sense of loss for a happiness I had never known in a man I was only just beginning to. I slid the photo back into the book without a word. But Julian had seen my hesitation. That was Eleanor, he said softly, not looking at me. We were in Greece. She was beautiful, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Yes, he said. She was. He paused, his hands still on a stack of music. It's strange. For years, I couldn't look at these things. Now it feels different. It feels like remembering, not just mourning. He finally turned to look at me, and his gray eyes were filled with a profound, unguarded sincerity. That's because of you. My breath caught in my throat. The air between us suddenly felt charged, thick with all the things we weren't saying. His gaze was so direct, so open. It felt like he was seeing straight through me, to the lonely, yearning core of me. I am not a brave person. My instinct is always to retreat, to build walls, to protect the small, fragile space I've carved out for myself. I looked away, down at the papers scattered on the table. I'm just sorting paper, Julian. No, he said, and his voice was firm but gentle. You're not. He didn't say anything more. He just went back to his work, leaving his words to hang in the air between us. But the dynamic had shifted. The line between employer and employee, between client and tradesman, had blurred into something else entirely, something I didn't have a name for. And it was terrifying. And it was wonderful. The weeks turned into a month, then two. The cataloging project was nearing its end. I stretched it out, working slower than I needed to, finding excuses to recheck boxes we'd already sorted. I couldn't bear the thought of it ending, of losing my reason to be in this quiet house, in his quiet company. One rainy Tuesday, my van decided to die. Not just sputter and complain, but die completely, right at the end of Julian's long driveway as I was leaving for the day. I tried the ignition again and again, but the engine wouldn't even turn over. Just a sad, defeated click. I sat there for a long moment, my forehead resting against the steering wheel, and felt a wave of hopeless frustration wash over me. The van was my livelihood. Without it, I couldn't work. A tow truck would be expensive. Repairs would be even more so. It was a financial disaster I simply couldn't afford. A soft tapping on the driver's side window made me jump. It was Julian, holding a large black umbrella over his head, his expression concerned. I rolled down the window, and the smell of rain and wet earth filled the cab. Trouble? He asked. It's dead, I said, the words feeling heavy and final. The starter, I think. Or maybe the alternator. I don't know. I ran a hand through my hair, feeling the panic begin to bubble in my chest. I'll have to call a tow. Don't be ridiculous, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Come inside. We'll call my mechanic in the morning. He makes house calls. And you'll take my car. What? No, I can't. I stammered, flustered. I can't just take your car. It's a car, Leo, he said, his voice calm and steady, a rock in my swirling sea of panic. It's meant to be driven. I have another. Now come out of the rain. He opened the door for me, holding the umbrella so I wouldn't get wet. I felt like a child, being looked after and cared for, and my stubborn pride fought against the sheer, overwhelming relief of it. I let him lead me back to the house, my shoulders slumped in defeat. He settled me in the kitchen, made me a cup of tea, and then made the call. He spoke with the mechanic in a low, efficient tone, arranging everything. When he hung up, he turned to me. "He'll be here at 9 tomorrow morning," he said. "He'll assess the damage and we'll go from there." He then picked up a small leather wallet from the counter and took out a set of keys, placing them on the table in front of me. "The Range Rover is in the garage. It's an automatic. It's all yours until your van is fixed." I stared at the keys. They lay on the polished wood of the table, a tangible symbol of his wealth, his power, his effortless ability to solve problems that would cripple me. And I hated it. I hated feeling so helpless, so dependent. "I can't, Julian," I said, my voice tight. "I'll pay for the mechanic, and I'll figure out the car situation. I can rent 1 inch." "Why?" he asked, his voice genuinely curious. He sat down opposite me, his gray eyes searching my face. "Why would you spend money you don't need to, just to make things more difficult?" "Because I don't want to owe you anything." I blurted out, the words raw and honest. "Because this isn't right." "You're my employer, am I?" he asked softly. "Is that all I am?" The question hung in the air, charged and dangerous. The rain beat against the window panes, a frantic rhythm that matched the beating of my heart. This was it. The moment where all the subtext, all the unspoken feelings that had been building for months, finally rose to the surface. I couldn't meet his eyes. I stared at the keys on the table. "I don't know what this is," I whispered. "Then let's find out," he said. His voice was still quiet, still calm, but there was a new intensity to it. "Leo, look at me." Slowly, I lifted my head. He was leaning forward, his hands resting on the table. His expression was serious, open, and incredibly vulnerable. "I am not offering you charity," he said, his words precise and deliberate. "I am offering you help because I care about what happens to you. Is that so difficult to accept?" "Yes," I admitted, my voice cracking. "Because I don't know why." "I don't know why you would care, don't you?" he asked, and a small, sad smile touched his lips. "You come into this silent house, and you fill it with your quiet competence. You handle things with care. You listen. You brought the music back. Do you really not know why I would value that? Why I would value you?" Every word was a revelation, a gentle dismantling of the walls I had so carefully constructed around myself. He wasn't seeing me as a project or a charity case. He was seeing me, the real me, the one who was careful and quiet and lonely. Tears pricked at the back of my eyes, and I blinked them away furiously. I would not cry. Not now. "Take the keys, Leo," he said, his voice a soft command. "Let me help you. There are no strings attached. Only my concern." I looked from his earnest face to the keys on the table. Taking them felt like a surrender, but not a defeat. It felt like letting go of a burden I had been carrying for a very long time. The burden of doing everything myself, of never asking for help, of never letting anyone in. My hand trembled as I reached out, and my fingers closed around the cool metal of the keys. His shoulders relaxed, a subtle but noticeable release of tension. "Good," he said softly. "Now, since you're not going anywhere tonight, you'll stay for dinner. And you'll stay in the guest room. We have an early start with the mechanic." He said it all so matter-of-factly, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. And in that moment, I let myself believe that it was. I let myself be taken care of. The next morning, the mechanic, a cheerful man named Sal, confirmed my fears. The van's engine was shot. It would need to be completely rebuilt or replaced. The cost was astronomical, a figure that made my stomach clench with dread. I stood there in the driveway, the damp morning air feeling cold on my skin, and felt the familiar weight of despair settle on me. It was over. My business, my independence, everything I had worked so hard for. It was all gone. Julian had been speaking quietly with Sal. When they finished, he walked over to me. He must have seen the look on my face, because his own expression softened with concern. "It's bad, isn't it?" I asked, my voice flat. "It's fixable," he said. "Sal can rebuild it. It will take a couple of weeks. I can't afford it," I said, the admission tasting like ash in my mouth. "There's no way. I'll take care of it," Julian said simply. "No," I said immediately, my pride flaring up again, a last, desperate defense. "Absolutely not. I won't let you. It's not a gift, Leo," he said, his voice patient, as if explaining something to a frightened child. "It's an advance. For the work you'll be doing here. I stared at him, confused. What work? The cataloging is almost finished. There are other things, he said, his gaze steady. The gardens need attention. The library needs reorganizing. There are always things that need a careful hand. We can work out a contract. You can pay me back over time, with no interest. It would be a business arrangement. I saw what he was doing. He was creating a world for me, a safe harbor where I could repair my life without losing my dignity. He was offering me a solution, wrapped in the guise of a formal arrangement, so that my stubborn pride could accept it. The sheer, overwhelming thoughtfulness of it broke through my final defenses. He wasn't trying to buy me or control me. He was trying to protect me. He was using his resources not to create an obligation, but to create safety. I looked at this man, this quiet, steady man who had seen something in me worth preserving, and I felt a wave of emotion so strong it almost buckled my knees. It was gratitude and admiration and a deep, terrifying affection that I could no longer deny. Why are you doing this? I asked, my voice thick. He stepped closer, so close I could see the fine lines around his gray eyes. Because, he said, his voice a low murmur meant only for me. I don't want you to leave. The world seemed to stop. The chirping of the birds, the rustle of the leaves, the distant hum of traffic, it all faded away. There was only his face, his words, and the profound, earth-shattering truth in his eyes. He wasn't talking about the job. He wasn't talking about the van. He was talking about me. He wanted me to stay. I felt a shift inside me, a quiet foundation settling into place. The fear I had been living with for so long, fear of failure, fear of intimacy, fear of being seen, began to recede, replaced by a fragile, burgeoning hope. Okay, I whispered. The word was small, but it felt momentous. It was an agreement. It was a beginning. The next couple of weeks passed in a strange, dreamlike state. I drove Julian's expensive car to my other, smaller jobs, feeling like an imposter. I spent my afternoons at his house, not cataloging music, but working in the garden alongside him, pulling weeds and pruning roses. We worked in a comfortable silence, our hands in the dirt. It was grounding, physical work. I discovered he was a knowledgeable and passionate gardener. He taught me the names of the flowers, the needs of the different plants. And as we worked, we talked. Not about anything important, really. We talked about the weather, about books, about music. Small talk. But it felt like we were weaving a tapestry, thread by thread, creating a connection that was quiet and strong and real. I never felt like an employee. I felt like a partner, an equal. He would ask my opinion on where to plant the new hydrangeas. He would listen to my ideas about rebuilding a crumbling stone wall. And when we were done for the day, we would sit on the patio, drinking iced tea, our muscles aching in a pleasant way, and watch the sun go down. I was falling in love with him. The realization didn't come in a sudden flash, but in a slow, dawning awareness, like the gradual warming of the earth in spring. It was in the way my heart would beat a little faster when he smiled. It was in the way I found myself memorizing the sound of his laugh, a rare and wonderful thing. It was in the way his presence had become the anchor of my days. I knew it was complicated. He was older, he was wealthy, he was my employer of sorts. He had a past, a great love that still filled the empty spaces of his house. And I was just me, a piano tuner with a broken-down van and a heart that had been closed for business for a very long time. But none of that seemed to matter when we were sitting on the patio, the scent of roses in the air, talking about nothing and everything. One evening, Sal called to say the van was ready. The news should have made me happy. It meant my independence was restored. It meant I could get back to my life. But all I felt was a cold knot of dread in my stomach. The arrangement would be over. The contract would be fulfilled, and I would have no more reason to be here. I told Julian the news as we were cleaning our tools. He stopped what he was doing, his back to me. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. That's good news, he finally said, his voice carefully neutral. Yes, I said, my own voice sounding hollow. It is. The rest of the evening was quiet. The easy companionship we had built felt strained, fragile. The unspoken question hung between us. What now? The next day, I drove his car to the garage to pick up my van. Sal had done an incredible job. The engine purred like a kitten. I paid him with the money Julian had advanced me, the transaction feeling formal and final. I drove my old van back to Julian's estate, the familiar rumble of the engine a comforting, yet melancholy sound. This was my world, and it was time to return to it. I found him in the music room, standing by the piano. He wasn't reading. He was just looking out the window at the garden we had tended together. "The van is running perfectly," I said from the doorway. "Thank you, Julian. I don't know how I can ever repay you." He turned to face me. His expression was unreadable, his gray eyes shadowed. "The contract is fulfilled, then," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said, my heart feeling like a lead weight in my chest. "I'll just get my things." I went to the table where my laptop and a few of my books were still sitting. I packed them into my bag, my movements slow, each action feeling like a final goodbye. Goodbye to this room. Goodbye to this house. Goodbye to him. I was ready to leave. I had my bag in my hand, my car keys in my pocket. I just had to walk out the door. But my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't do it. I couldn't just walk away and pretend the last few months hadn't happened. He was still standing by the piano, watching me. The silence was deafening. It was a moment stretched thin, shimmering with all the things we hadn't said, all the feelings we hadn't acknowledged. This is it. The thought is sharp, clear. Now or never. I put my bag down. I walked over to the piano, my heart hammering against my ribs. I stopped in front of him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. I had to tilt my head back slightly to meet his eyes. "The piano sounds wonderful," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Yes," he said, his gaze fixed on my face. "You did a beautiful job. The work is done," I said, forcing the words out. "I have no reason to be here anymore." A flicker of something, pain maybe, crossed his face. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose you don't." He started to turn away, a gesture of dismissal, of retreat into his solitary world. And I couldn't let him. "Julian," I said, his name a plea. He stopped, his back still mostly to me. "Is that it then?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "Do you just let me go?" Slowly, he turned back to face me. His face was a mask of careful control, but his eyes were filled with a raw, aching turmoil. "What do you want me to do, Leo?" he asked, his voice rough. "You value your independence. I know that. I will not. I will not presume, I repeated, a humorless laugh escaping me. "After all this, after everything." I took a step closer. He didn't move. The air between us thrummed with a palpable energy. I could see the pulse beating in the hollow of his throat. "I don't want to go," I confessed, the words tumbling out of me, quiet and desperate and utterly true. "I don't want this to be over." He closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if my words were a physical blow. When he opened them again, the control was gone, replaced by a vulnerability that mirrored my own. He lifted a hand, as if to touch my face, but then let it drop back to his side. He looked at the piano, at the gleaming ebony wood, and then back at me. He reached out and gently, deliberately, lowered the fallboard, covering the keys. The soft thud of the wood was the only sound in the room. It felt like a final, definitive action, an ending. He leaned closer, his other hand resting on the polished lid. The space between us shrank until there was no space at all. His clean, woody scent filled my senses. His breath was warm on my cheek. And then he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly thing that sent a shiver down my spine. "Stay." It wasn't a question. It was a single word, holding a world of meaning. "Just," he whispered, his forehead now resting against mine, his eyes closed. "Stay a note longer." My own eyes fluttered shut. My breath hitched. The weight of his presence, the soft gravity of his touch that wasn't even a touch yet, was overwhelming. Here, in this moment, the power dynamics, the age, the money, it all dissolved. We were just two men, standing so close, on the precipice of something terrifying and beautiful. "Why?" I whispered back, needing to hear it, needing the final, undeniable truth. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his gray eyes dark with an emotion I could finally name. It was desire. It was yearning. It was the same emotion that was churning inside of me. "Because this room has been silent for too long," he said, his voice thick with feeling. "And you are the music." And then he kissed me. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of arrival. It was soft and slow and hesitant at first, as if he was asking a question. My lips parted under his, a silent answer. His hand came up to cup the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, and he drew me closer. The kiss deepened, and it was like coming home to a place I had never been before. It tasted of loneliness and longing and a profound, bone-deep relief. It was right. It was so incredibly, fundamentally right. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He didn't let me go. He kept his hand on my neck, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin behind my ear. Our foreheads were still pressed together. I could feel the tremor in his hand, and it made my own heart ache with a fierce, protective tenderness. "Leo," he breathed, his voice unsteady. "I'm here," I whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." He let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of such profound release that it seemed to carry years of solitude with it. He laced his fingers with mine, his grip firm and grounding. In that moment, holding his hand, feeling the solid, steady presence of him, I felt safer than I had ever felt in my entire life. The morning after was disorienting. I woke up not in my own cramped bed, but in the cool, crisp sheets of Julian's guest room. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, painting stripes of gold across the plush carpet. For a moment, I was confused, my mind struggling to catch up. Then the memory of the previous evening rushed back in a warm, overwhelming wave. The confession, the kiss. I had stayed, not just for dinner, but for the night. After that kiss, leaving had been unthinkable. We hadn't done anything more. We had simply talked, for hours, sitting on the sofa in the music room, our hands still linked. We talked about our lives, our fears, the quiet loneliness that had defined both of us for so long. It was an unburdening, a gentle exploration of the spaces we had kept hidden. He had walked me to the guest room, squeezed my hand at the door, and said, "Sleep well, Leo." Now, in the bright light of day, a sliver of anxiety began to creep in. The realities of our situation felt more stark. The vast, silent house. The sheer, undeniable fact of his wealth and my lack of it. Last night, in the intimacy of the darkened music room, we had been two men finding each other. This morning, I was a piano tuner in a rich man's guest room, and the imbalance felt immense. I showered and dressed in my work clothes from the day before, feeling rumpled and out of place. When I came downstairs, my footsteps echoing in the quiet hall, I found him in the kitchen. He was standing at the counter, wearing a simple white shirt and gray trousers, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. He looked up as I entered, and a small, almost shy smile touched his lips. "Good morning," he said, his voice a little rough, as if he wasn't used to saying it to anyone. "Morning," I replied, my own voice tight with a nervousness I couldn't hide. He pushed one of the mugs across the marble countertop towards me. "I wasn't sure how you took it. Black is perfect," I said, my fingers wrapping around the warm ceramic. The simple gesture, the remembered detail, eased some of the tension in my shoulders. We stood in silence for a moment, sipping our coffee. The air was thick with unspoken questions. What now? What was this? Was last night real? Julian, as always, was the one to break the silence. He leaned against the counter, his expression serious but kind. "Leo," he began, his voice steady. "I need to be very clear about something. What happened last night, it was not a transaction. It has nothing to do with your van, or the work you've done here. It has to do with you. Only you." He was addressing my fears head-on, naming the ugly doubt that had been whispering in my ear since I woke up. He was giving me the reassurance I hadn't even known how to ask for. "I know," I said, though I was only just beginning to truly believe it. "I want to be sure you know," he insisted gently. "I am acutely aware of the disparity in our circumstances, and I will not have you ever feeling indebted or obligated to me. This, whatever this is between us, it can only work if we are equals. In every way that matters." He was laying the groundwork, setting the terms of engagement with a careful, ethical precision that was so fundamentally him. He wasn't just acknowledging the power imbalance. He was actively working to dismantle it. "So, let's be practical," he continued, shifting into a more business-like tone, which I recognized as his way of managing difficult emotions. "The van is repaired. The advance for that repair can be repaid via a formal payment plan, which we will write down and sign. Any future work you do for me will be contracted and invoiced as it would be with any other client. Your financial independence is yours. It is not on the table." He paused, his gray eyes searching my face. "Is that clear?" I felt a profound wave of relief wash over me. He understood. He saw the potential pitfalls, the things that could curdle this fragile new connection, and he was clearing them out of the way. He was protecting me, But more than that, he was protecting us. Yes, I said, my voice firm and clear. It's clear. Thank you, he nodded. A single, decisive gesture. Good, he said. The tension in the room dissipated, replaced by a quiet sense of possibility. He pushed away from the counter and took a small step closer to me. He reached out, not to kiss me, but to simply lay his hand on my arm. His touch was warm and grounding. Now that the business is out of the way, he said, his voice softening again, I would very much like to take you to dinner tonight. Not here. Somewhere else. As a date, he said the word date with a slight, charming awkwardness, as if he hadn't used it in a very long time. A real smile, bright and unforced, spread across my face. I would like that very much, I said. The day felt like a new beginning. I went about my scheduled tunings in my own van, the familiar rumble of the engine a comforting reminder of my independence. But everything felt different. The world seemed sharper, the colors more vibrant. A quiet joy hummed beneath the surface of my skin. Later that afternoon, we met a small test, a moment that could have been awkward but instead became a point of affirmation. I had returned to Julian's house to get ready for our date, and we decided to walk into the small, nearby village to pick up a bottle of wine. As we were walking down the main street, side by side, Mrs. Gable, a notorious town gossip whose piano I had tuned last year, spotted us from across the road. Her eyes widened, and her gaze flickered between Julian, the town's wealthy recluse, and me, the guy with the beat-up van. I could almost see the gears turning in her head. I felt a flush of self-consciousness. I tensed, my old instinct to become invisible kicking in. I instinctively put a little more distance between myself and Julian. Julian, however, did the opposite. He seemed not to notice her at all, but I knew he had. In a smooth, subtle movement, he closed the distance between us again. And then he did something incredibly simple and incredibly profound. He gently placed his hand on the small of my back. It wasn't a possessive gesture. It was a gesture of solidarity, of quiet reassurance. It said, I am with him. We are together. There is nothing to hide. The warmth of his hand seeped through my shirt, steadying me. My anxiety melted away, replaced by a surge of gratitude. He wasn't ashamed. He wasn't hiding me. We were just two men, walking down the street. I relaxed, my stride matching his again. We continued on our way, and I didn't look back at Mrs. Gable. She didn't matter. Our date was perfect. Not because it was fancy. He took me to a small, quiet Italian restaurant, but because it was easy. We talked and laughed, and I saw a lighter, more relaxed side of him that I had never seen before. He asked me about my childhood, my dreams, the reasons I fell in love with pianos. And I asked him about his life, his work before he retired, his travels. We didn't talk about his wife. We didn't talk about my struggles. We just talked about us, as we were now, in the present. We were building something new, on its own terms. When he dropped me off at my apartment later that night, he walked me to the door. Under the dim, buzzing light of the hallway, he took my face in his hands. I had a wonderful evening, Leo, he said, his voice sincere. Me too, I said, my heart full. He kissed me again, a sweet, lingering kiss that was full of promise. I'll see you tomorrow, he murmured against my lips. And I knew he would. This wasn't a fleeting thing. This was real. The following weeks settled into a new, beautiful rhythm. We were careful. We were deliberate. We were building our connection brick by brick, with a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. I continued my work, and he respected the boundaries of it. But my evenings and my weekends were spent with him. His vast, intimidating house began to feel like a home. I learned the quirks of the old plumbing and which windows stuck in the rain. We cooked together in his enormous kitchen, my simple recipes feeling just as at home there as his more elaborate ones. We'd eat dinner on the patio, watching the fireflies begin to dip the twilight. One Saturday, we spent the entire day in the music room. But we weren't working. He had pulled out a dusty box of old vinyl records. We listened to everything from classical symphonies to old jazz standards. At one point, a slow, romantic ballad by Ella Fitzgerald came on. Julian stood up and held out his hand to me. May I have this dance? He asked, a playful glint in his eye. I laughed, feeling a blush creep up my neck. I can't dance, I protested. Neither can I, he said with a smile. We can be terrible together. I took his hand, and he pulled me to my feet. He drew me close, one hand on my waist, the other holding mine, and we swayed slowly to the music in the middle of the room. I rested my head on his shoulder, his cashmere sweater soft against my cheek. I could feel the steady beat of his heart against my ear. In that moment, surrounded by the music, held safely in his arms, a profound sense of peace settled over me. All the jagged edges of my life, all the fear and the loneliness, seemed to smooth out. This was what it felt like to be home. It wasn't about a place. It was about a person. Leo, he murmured into my hair. I'm happy, he said, his voice quiet and full of wonder, as if it were a new and surprising discovery. I pulled my head back to look at him. His face was soft in the afternoon light, his gray eyes shining. Me too, Julian, I said, my voice thick with an emotion so deep I had no words for it. I'm so happy. I had come to his house to fix a piano. I had been a tradesman, a hired hand, adrift in a life that felt temporary and uncertain. I had been guarded and lonely, convinced that my life was destined to be a solo performance. But he had seen through all of that. He had listened, not just to the piano, but to me. He had used his resources not to control, but to care. He had offered me safety, but more importantly, he had offered me equality. And in doing so, he had opened a door in me that I thought was locked forever. The difference in our ages, the difference in our bank accounts, those things hadn't vanished. They were still facts of our lives. But they had become context, not a cage. They were simply part of the landscape of the new world we were building together, a world built on a quiet foundation of mutual care, unwavering respect, and a love that had arrived as softly and surely as a perfectly tuned chord. I was no longer just a piano tuner, and he was no longer just a client. We were two men who had found the music in each other, and our song was just beginning. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment stayed with you? If the story resonated, a like helps others find it. Subscribe for more slow burn male/male love stories told with warmth and care.